Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. I see some familiar names in the chat coming through there, so great to see you all, and happy that you are with us, and looking forward to hearing from the rest of you in our Q&A at the end. So as Fabio has mentioned, yeah, that is our topic for today. So to kick it off, of course, we need to be clear about, what it is that we are speaking about when we're talking about anti-gender politics or movements. And the definition that we are working with in our understanding in the report that we've done for UNRISD is is defining it as a transnational, and that is so key, right? Network of conservative activists and organizations working to counter and undermine political and social gains made by local and international queer and feminist rights advocacy over the past few decades, right? These anti-gender actors are operating at local, regional, and global levels. We'll get into a little bit more of that in a moment. And they're working, with this package of issues that is not new necessarily when it comes to, for example, if you look at the history of the U.S. Christian right and their so-called family values agenda. But, we're seeing this at a global level currently, where there's this package of issues that includes LGBTIQ plus rights, reproductive justice, comprehensive sexuality education, and gender studies programs at tertiary levels. So, they're opposing this whole group of issues together. And key, again, and unfortunately, we don't have time to get into this, but there is more detail about this in the report, is just the fact that these anti-gender actors are sustained and, enabled by enormous amounts of funding. There's been research by Open Democracy and European Parliamentary Forum, for example, showing that a lot of the money that sustains anti-gender actors transnationally is coming from the US. But also there's research showing that some of this money is coming from Russia. So yeah, we encourage you to look into that in our report. Lata, can you please go to the next slide? So also, of course, in defining, what it is we're talking about, it's important to get into this idea of anti-gender. What does it mean? And how is this term used? So, whilst critics like ourselves, of these campaigns to oppose, reproductive justice, LGBTIQ plus rights, and so forth, while we may refer to them as anti-gender, and this has become a term widely used to talk about these groups, or sometimes you'll hear people use anti-rights or anti-feminist. These groups position and frame themselves in positive terms, right, as being pro-family. So they say that they are defending the so-called natural family or the traditional family and family values. And by that, of course, they are not talking about all families. If they were, we probably wouldn't be in such a situation like we see now. They're only referring to the heterosexual family defined by a man and a woman who are married and are having, and their own biological children. So that is where the issue comes in with the so-called pro-family framing, is the only kind of family that they are referring to. Lata, over to you.
Thank you, Haley. Where we were very keen to be able to make a contribution, and where both of us found our research interest dovetailing around anti-gender movements, was the use of anti-colonial frames as a very explicit strategy to discredit inclusive policy language. So the starting point in so much of our discourse and practice as Haley has noted, is the idea that society is made up of discrete family units consisting of a married, monogamous, and reproductive man and woman. But we would argue that there is nothing natural about organizing our societies this way. Now, whether we call it nuclear, modern, bourgeoisie family, what's important is that putting that idea of a family at the center of our social construction was positioned as a mark of civilization. And it then became a notion used to classify people and societies that then did not practice this particular order of kinship as uncivilized. Now, we will go back into an analysis of the natural family in more detail later on in our presentation. But what we would note then is if we center the nuclear family, the sort of the corollary of that is effectively a rejection of LGBTIQ plus identities. These are then seen as unnatural. And what we saw was British colonialism in particular actually put that idea of unnatural human behavior into its penal codes, right, into its colonial laws. Now, what we find now is that a focus of a lot of discussions in aid spaces, quite rightly, and something to be celebrated, is an idea of promoting positive associations around sexual rights. But some of that very often can get tied up with assumptions that part of what we are challenging is a so called backward global south that is not embodying a more progressive norms around sexual rights that come from the global north. Now, what we get then is LGBTQ rights effectively seen as a sort of uniquely Western or global North preoccupation, and it brushes under the carpet the colonial legacies that may underpin the continued denial of these rights. Now, one of the perverse consequences of that is we get a sort of historical inversion where many anti-gender actors will then adopt anti-colonial frames to construct their anti-LGBTIQ plus or their anti-sexual and reproductive health and rights narratives in relation to the protection of tradition. So we don't like all of these unnatural ways of living and being because we are sort of we're protecting our traditional values, whereas in fact it's an inversion of that history because so many of these ideas of natural families that are rejecting LGBTIQ plus rights are substantially rooted in colonialism. We would also want to highlight that this is not a kind of a niche sort of thinking because the UN's Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner, or OHCHR, recently commissioned work on the relationship between colonialism and sexual orientation and gender identity. And this is also a report that myself and Haley, through our engagement with UNRISD, we contributed, we made a submission to this call as well on the back of this report. And what's clear is that coloniality is increasingly being seen as central to understanding how and upholding, but also visible backsliding in LGBTIQ plus rights. So I'll turn over to you, Haley.
Okay. Okay, so yeah, these narratives that Lata was just outlining, I mean, we find this across the various spheres where pro-family or anti-gender activists are operating. So on one hand, we see these kinds of grassroots level campaigns, which will be demonstrations or online petitions. They'll be on various kinds of media or social media, doing a lot of disinformation campaigning. But often, when at the face of it, you'll see a kind of, protest against comprehensive sexuality education, for example. But when you start looking into that a little bit more and see who some of the leaders of that demonstration are or the organizations involved, you will typically find that there are other groups that are located somewhere else in the world, um, who are involved, right, in that campaign. And that's where we see the transnational elements quite a lot. But also, at the transnational and, at the national level, there are, anti-gender actors who are lobbying policymakers to oppose language and frameworks that are inclusive of sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex characteristics. So that's SOGIESC, that acronym, in case you're not familiar with it. They're doing a lot of strategic litigation as well. And you can read some examples of that in the report as well. But also, and I see there are many people in the group here today working for various UN agencies and are familiar with the UN space. I mean, you will know that these groups are extremely active at the UN level, doing lobbying at UN international gatherings. Diplomatic lobbying, and they're coalition building, right? They're building coalitions of representatives and NGOs who are, aligned with the objectives of opposing any kinds of language that could potentially be inclusive of gender and sexuality diversity, or having recognition of families rather than the family in policies or resolutions and other frameworks. And there's this UN Family Rights Caucus, which has been around, I think, since 2008, if I'm not mistaken. And there's the group of Friends of the Family. So yeah, it's, I think, really important to recognize that, there's advocacy at all of these levels. And again, this is in many ways made possible by the fact that there is a lot of money that's going into these kinds of agendas and campaigns and efforts to erode and roll back gains that have been made over the course of the past few decades. Lata, I think you are next.
Thank you, Haley. Now, one of the things that we were very keen to draw attention to, and Haley, you've started saying that, and I think that's so valuable in just mapping out where these messages are being shared. But one of the things that also became clear as we were bringing together our ideas is that it wasn't just important where they were sharing these messages, but how they were doing it. And one of the things that's become really clear that our desk research reveals is the increasing professionalization that delivers pro-family messaging in the same breath as sustainable development and in the twin cloaks of neutrality and rigor. And then they're disseminated using mainstream knowledge validation tools. So you'll get glossy reports and lovely looking websites, and we'll have international conferences, and some of which we've sort of screenshotted on the right of this slide here, just to give you a flavor of what that sort of looks like. Whereas historically, we can see more direct and overt connection to sort of religion and this idea that there are certain religious motivations for this activism. Anti-gender movements have now understood that they need to adopt the veneer of a more politically neutral academic register in how they communicate their key messages. So many of the stakeholders in this movement are now fashioning themselves as think tanks, INGOs, they have branches in different countries. They then bring on board research fellows who produce peer reviewed research, overseen by their international advisory boards and funded by philanthro-capitalists. And so here, one of the ways in which we identify in the report that this has been done is the use of like global data sets. So if you look at some of these reports, like the report cover that we've screenshotted on the right here, you'll see them engage really quite fulsomely with things like World Bank data, OECD data, but then they'll use that to prove concerns around the need to promote nuclear families or concerns around the demographic winter, which we will come back to and explain in more detail shortly. But the key is that they're using these academic registers And this is then amplified by links to higher education. So what we see is so many of the reports that are being produced, again, like this one that's been screenshotted here, but many others are actually spearheaded. So the main author will actually be a professor at a university who has tenure. And so what we do is then get us a kind of messaging that, because it's been written by an academic, it's engaging in substantial data analysis, then it becomes very difficult to push back and tease out um, what's sort of driving the ways in which the movement is sort of shaping their messages, because it all seems, again, quite commonsensical and also quite rigorous. So pushing back becomes much harder. And here we would also note um, that they're very, very actively appropriating the language of development and rights. And they recognize the importance and power of aligning their arguments explicitly with development imperatives. So again, alongside, the production of these reports and establishing these think tanks and what we might call this information ecosystem to support the ideas getting into the public domain at all of the levels that Haley has highlighted, there is also a very deliberate use of a more technocratic development jargon. And it's not, again, done in an abstract way. It is done specifically to engage with UN frameworks like the SDGs or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, one of the arguments that we make in this report this is that this space has been partially created by mainstream development formulations where we see the language of gender itself tends overwhelmingly to align with an instrumentalizing what we might call a smart economics approach. And here, so smart economics is a reference to a way that we might focus on amplifying the concerns of women and girls, right? This is sort of the idea of women and girls as a sort of separate sort of interest group and a focus of intervention in so much of our mainstream development discourse and practice. But smart economics is sort of seeing those investments in women and girls, not just because of their embodied rights, but also as a way of achieving other things like poverty reduction or addressing climate crisis or challenging concerns around conflict and achieving peace. So it is then intuitive or common sense to suggest that the best way to help women and girls is to put forward policies to establish and strengthen nuclear families. So we might say, okay, well, we recognize, things like female-headed households and concerns around poverty. A common sense approach to that would be to say, oh well, then let's promote marriage. Let's promote stronger nuclear families because we want to address concerns around single parent female headed households. And as the quote that we've highlighted here from our report notes, women's role is crucial in then again in a sort of instrumental way strengthening nation states and thus development itself. So Haley, back over to you.
Okay. So as Lata has mentioned, we're in this, in our report, we really focused on how anti-gender actors are using, on the one hand, the language of rights, and on the other hand, the language of development and sustainability. So one example or two examples here of how they are appropriating human rights languaging to counter SRHR and LGBTIQ rights and inclusion are the San Jose Articles and this Geneva Consensus Declaration, which I'm sure several of you are familiar with. So both of these, I think, are wonderful illustrations of how they are, using this language of rights, and it also, shows us why this framing of anti-rights is not necessarily that, might not be the most accurate description of these movements, because they are proposing alternative understandings of rights in many cases. So for instance, on the left here, the San Jose articles on the status of the unborn child. It was signed in 2011 by 42 organizations, political parties, and individuals with institutional power. And this focuses on the rights of the quote unquote unborn child, declaring that there is no right to abortion in international law, and that unborn children deserve protection, and that there is no human right to an abortion. And it also concludes that people, providers of development aid should not promote or fund abortion, and that they should not have aid conditionalities around the availability of abortion. And then the Geneva Consensus Declaration, which is much more recent, of course, it is very similar in the sense, of how it's about, abortion on the one hand, and also saying that there is no international right to an abortion. But what's really interesting, I think, about the Geneva Consensus Declaration is that it uses this language, this title of the Geneva Declaration of 1924, which was the first declaration on the rights of the child, and affirmed for the very first time the existence of rights specific to children and the responsibility of adults towards children. And then the Geneva Consensus Declaration, was, of course, very unprecedented in the sense that it was the first time in history that governments, including the U.S., Saudi Arabia, Brazil, Bahrain, Hungary, etc., described themselves as being like-minded on the subject of women's roles and rights. And what this document, if you just read this document kind of uncritically, it's framed as though it is concerned with women's health and women's rights. But actually, it's all about, undermining access to sexual and reproductive health and rights. And, it has these 4 pillars, like this, this concern for women's health. So it sounds all great, right? To the unsuspecting reader. It's when you start really reading it much more closely that you see what is the kinds of rights that it's actually trying to restrict through its claims to be, being promoting human life. Of course, they're talking about this unborn child, not the life of a person who is carrying an unborn child. And of course, always this language of unborn child, as we know, decenters the person who is carrying a fetus, right? It decenters that person, placing more emphasis on the fetus, which, through this use of this language of unborn child. And again, here, they really drill in the idea of the family. Of course, it's the family. So we also know, when you see the family like that in a singular framing, they're talking about the heterosexual family only, married parents only, having their biological children. And it also, this document really talks about how the sovereignty of nations is kind of dependent on their ability to protect and have their own so-called life protection policies. Okay, Lata, I think, or I'm next as well. Yeah, can you go to the next slide, please? So that's the rights framing that we can see in anti-gender rhetoric and knowledge production at the moment. But also, there's this way in which they are using the framing of development and sustainability. So on the right-hand side is a report. This is a very excellent illustration of what Lata was mentioning around the professionalization of pro-family activism, where they're being extremely deliberate about not expressing their fundamentalist religious ideologies, right? And realizing, and I've seen it written, where they say we won't be taken seriously if we are using our religious arguments. We need to use, arguments grounded in scientific evidence and social scientific evidence, and the development of these social scientific concepts to carry these ideas, to make them appear mainstream, to make them seem like they fit well within existing frameworks. So, I mean, development is a big place where they've been lobbying and doing a lot of advocacy work. So there's this idea of again, the natural family, which they are tying to the idea of economic prosperity by saying that economic prosperity and development is not only tied to, as I've got in the slide here, but it's actually, they're saying, dependent on compulsory heterosexuality, reproductivity, and the nuclear family model or institution. And then secondly is this very fascinating idea of demographic winter, which establishes this narrative of global depopulation that is going to be leading us towards economic disaster. And we will speak more about that in a moment. Lata, over to you.
Thank you, Haley. So to spend just a little bit more time now unpacking the centrality of the idea of the natural family, even if we were to accept that economic prosperity is our main goal, and we would argue that that isn't our main goal, but let's, even if we were to say that that's what we wanted to achieve, then there's this one notion that then gets introduced by anti-gender or pro-family actors called the marriage premium. And so this again is a contested idea in the social sciences, but has been taken up in an unambiguously positive way within pro-family advocacy spaces. So even if we were keen on a focus on economic development, and there may be, moments where that is important, we would still be able to identify problems. So the marriage premium sort of it centers heterosexual marriage, and again, as Haley said, links it explicitly to economic productivity, right? So it's very much again working with the grain of how we talk about development in our mainstream spaces, right? So when we talk about economic development, pro-family actors would say, well, if you want economic development, women's economic empowerment, then here's this concept of the marriage premium, where heterosexual marriage is seen as a positive contribution to that goal. And then, of
Sorry,
course,
Lata,
again,
we've got 5 minutes. I'm just giving us the 5-minute warning.
okay, great. Equally, if we take the other side of that, again, as we said earlier, the corollary to that is that then sex and partnership outside of marriage, LGBTIQ plus rights, these are all seen as antithetical to these goals. So any kind of non-conformity means that you're not contributing to economic growth and development. So we can see the ways in which those elisions are then made between sexuality and economic development in favor of the idea of pro-family. And what that really signals for us, and again, one of the things we were keen to sort of highlight here, is that there is a tendency in our discourse for our for the way we talk about, say, women and girls. There is a heteronormativity there. There is obviously a literature and a scholarship that talks about that as well. And there's a danger here in terms of the pro-family arguments that we then exclude, even if we're having that narrow focus on economics, that we exclude the contributions of LGBTIQ plus people and their experiences, and then their erasure to strengthening goals, like if we wanted to achieve economic development, the contributions that LGBTIQ plus people can make. So obviously we would argue that there's no that relationship between the family and economic development is a false connection to be making. Haley, I'll turn over to you to talk about demographic winter.
Okay. So this idea of demographic winter, really is this, it's a pronatalist theory about the relationship between reproduction, economic development, and sustainability. Um, and it, in many ways, has grown out of this idea that came out of the Vatican in the 1990s that feminism and gay rights are promoting a so-called culture of death. If you're not familiar with that, you can Google culture of death and you will find more about that. And this has really become a crisis theme within pro family politics, and it's used to mobilize fear of all kinds of changing social norms relating to gender and sexuality. And there are really three dimensions of this idea, of this demographic winter concept. And there's a scholar named Rita Trimble who wrote a really wonderful article about this in 2018 that I would encourage you to read if you're interested in knowing more. But what she says, and I must say I fully agree, is that this idea, on the one hand, it establishes this idea of global depopulation that is going to lead us towards economic disaster. And of course, in talking about global depopulation, they're really talking about depopulation in the global north countries. And that really shows how, beneath this idea of, protecting the nuclear family is this deeply ethno-nationalist and xenophobic logic that wants, people in these global north countries wants to encourage them, the citizens, the so-called ethnic nationals or whatever we want to call them, to reproduce, have children. Like in Hungary, we can see all kinds of economic incentives for having 4 or more children, encouraging people to do that so that they do not need to rely on migrants, right? They don't want migrants coming into their countries, and this is how we can see, this what's beneath, right? This pro-family logic. Um, Also, it commits women to reproductive obligation or forced motherhood. And again, it says that family crisis, right, is the cause of population decline, not war, conflict, economic disaster, or, sorry, not economic, environmental, natural disasters that have resulted from climate change and all sorts of things. So it, really says that family crisis, right, and that family crisis, which has been caused by feminism and queer social movements, is causing population decline, which is going to create economic, right, catastrophe. And this is becoming a very persuasive argument. And, in many spaces in global South contexts, as Lata will talk about in the next slide.
Great. Thank you, Haley. So we just want to draw your attention in this slide to two things. So the first is, and again, in thinking about how we engage with the question of anti-gender movements, and in other spaces this is being referred to as rollback. One of the things that's very striking is that some of the most strident voices within these pro-family and anti-gender movements are women. So when we talk about questions around, say, representation and power, and how we talk about women's rights amidst the challenges that anti-gender movements place on the way we address questions of gender equality, we have to be clear that it's that women are actually at the forefront of some of this key messaging. So here we have a quote from Sharon Slater, who's head of Family Watch International, and talking about, people as the nation's most valuable resource. But with the quote on the right from Anne Kiyoko, who's from Citizen Go Africa, the other thing that the idea of demographic winter taps into is that questions of population control, fertility, and demographics have always been a part of how we understand global development challenges. And unfortunately, this has a history of being done in deeply racist ways. So high fertility rates, large populations, what's come to be known as the youth bulge, particularly in African countries, then talk of, say, homosexuality and abortion is often equated as tools by the West that are used by the West to reduce fertility in these countries, consistent with a history where population control is seen as the way to solve the challenges that Africa, as a sort of, when we think about it in a race homogenous way, historically, which is obviously racist, to see that as a way of managing crisis. Population control brings up the echoes of that way of dealing with challenges on the African continent. So Anne Kiyoko kind of is tapping into that history, sort of saying, well, actually, then the logical extension of that argument is then to frame strengthening families, which also fits into the smart economics frame, as an investment in human capital from which communities, regions, and countries can reap a demographic dividend. And it sits against that history of thinking about and the challenges that a population control discourse has surfaced historically within this space. So we've got our very last slide, and I'll turn over to Haley to talk us through our final points.
Okay. So to kind of wrap it up, that kind of super fast presentation is, these pro-family and anti-gender stakeholders clearly are becoming very skilled at co-opting the language of rights, development, and sustainability in order to advance their agendas. And really in doing so, coming across as unbigoted, not prejudiced, they are, saying, we're just looking out for the best interests of the nation and the economy, and sounding very reasonable, right? Making a very deliberate effort to sound reasonable, and not biased, by their religious ideology. And then using, of course, these economic justifications to, legitimize political agendas that oppress queer people, that, restrict access to sexual and reproductive rights and education. Lata, I think you're on the last 2 points here.
Yes, thank you. We would also want to, again, as Haley says, a bit of a whistle stop, but we would also want to highlight what we see as the dominance of heteronormativity as the sort of key frame in how we talk about issues around gender and sexuality and development discourse and practice. That, we would argue, creates the space, sort of reflecting the instrumentalizing that comes out of a smart economics approach to investing in women and girls, where then a pro-family position is pitched as sort of common sense, right? So again, Haley's point about we're neutral. This is just a common sense thing to do, to have strengthen nuclear families. And really what this does then, it really threatens human rights and social justice efforts to address historical, because we talked about the sort of the use of anti-colonial frames, which we have argued is an inversion of the ways in which LGBTQ rights interact with our colonial histories. So our ability to sort of push back and address historical and systemic inequalities at all levels, so national, multilateral, but regional and local, is threatened. So what we'll do is we'll leave it there. We thank you all for coming. Obviously, thanks to UNRISD for commissioning and championing this research, and for arranging this event. And we're really looking forward to all of your questions. And we really hope that this is just the start of these important conversations. Thank you really very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Lata and Haley, for this interesting presentation. Let's go to the Q&A space, and we have here, I can see some questions. Let's go to the first. It's from Maria Catarina Porqueriño. She asks the following question: how can advancements in in reproductive justice and gender rights be pursued in a country with a government resistant to change, religion-bound, and holding heteronormative, anti-gender views of society? Can internal and grassroots and other external social movements alone drive progress in these areas? And
Love
let me put this question with another one
Okay.
that is related. I saw maybe this one. Yeah, there's another one. Have you already explored the power role of broad LGBTQ advocating faith groups like Anglicans, liberal Jews, etc., to win these battles within the faith communities to counsel religious narratives? Maybe we can begin with these two questions.
Haley, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure, sure. I mean, I think the first question, I mean, it's a huge question. And, I think that from what from the research that I've done, it's, in many ways incremental approaches that are the best when it comes to dealing with anti-gender ideology when it is institutionalized at the highest levels of government. And I think in terms of the finding we need to think about narratives that can be used, right, to shift or even find narratives that can help bring together, right, people on different ends of the political spectrum when it comes to this issue. So one thing that I've seen and heard that has worked well in that regard is focusing on care work, politics of care, who's doing care work, right, in the family, in families, and approaching that as an issue where maybe some kinds of progress can be made in terms of rights for women, for gender diverse and non-conforming people and people of different sexual orientations. And then when it comes to the inclusive faith communities, I mean, I think that is where really exciting work is happening. There are so many inclusive faith leaders and communities out there. And, in the conversations I've had with these kinds of actors, they are very angry about the fact that you have, these far-right conservative groups who are often claiming to speak on behalf of entire religious communities. So, I mean, there is a lot of action happening in the inclusive faith sector, and I think it's probably one of the most powerful ways of countering and challenging the anti-gender rhetoric, when it is using the religious frames. Yeah.
Yeah,
Lots.
and yeah, I mean, all of that's, yeah, fantastic, and I'm really glad you mentioned that, because I think that appropriation of the religious frames and the fact that people get angry, but I think that's really important. There are so many people pushing back. I mean, just on the first question, I completely agree, because I think in a way one of the things that is very striking is if we can, you know, organizations in a range of contexts draw a lot of strength from global level solidarity. And one of the things that a colonial understanding of that history that brings us this more nuanced perspective on how we think about the position of the nuclear family, or where and how pushbacks against LGBTIQ plus rights might originate, is actually quite helpful, because if we want to offer global solidarity and we take that colonial history into account, then we can approach that solidarity with a sense of humility. Because I think one of the things that can be quite difficult in lots of contexts, and this is something that we mentioned and we talk about more in the report, is the sense that LGBTIQ plus advocacy is a sort of Western imposition. Whereas if our approach is actually, we recognize that there's a fraught history here, and we're actually doing it because we think human rights are about everyone and should include everyone, then there are lots of really good examples of sexual rights advocacy that does then try to indigenize those ideas. So yes, we can draw strength from the global sort of movements around LGBTIQ plus rights, like supporting them, but actually to demonstrate. And I think, Haley, I'm really glad you said that, because I have, there were lots of really positive advocacy initiatives in places like India that were trying to say, look, this is not a Western imposition. LGBTIQ plus rights are also an Indian thing, and it's something that we should celebrate. And it that indigenizing became really, really important. but the global solidarity was also important, right, in order to give them strength to be able to have those messaging. So I think both those things happen. And certainly in the report, one of the things we draw attention to, so we'd encourage you all to look at that reference in our report, is work by one of my colleagues at the University of Leeds, Adrienne van Klinken, who's spent a long time working around LGBTIQ plus rights and at the intersection of LGBTIQ plus advocacy and religious communities. So people who identify with, say, queer identities, but also have very strong religious identities, and it's very inspiring work. It's tiring, it's hard. It it can be open to concerns around persecution and targeting, but there's lots of hope to be taken from that work. I think that we really need to be focusing on and supporting vocally as wherever we can, for sure.
Okay, I see questions about the strategies. What do you think are the strategies that must put in place to counter this? From feminist organizations and from queer movements, what do you think? People are asking for strategies.
Yeah. Well, to be honest, I mean, on one hand, it's not the safest place to talk about strategy now, is it? Right? But what I can say is, from my perspective, I think knowledge, like research, is extremely important. I think it's very much underestimated that, in order to strategize, we need to understand what it is we are dealing with. And it's not, I think there's a common perception that, the kinds of issues and opposition we're facing today, that it's just the same as the backlash, so-called backlash of the 90s and even earlier. But it's extreme. It's very different from that. And I think, we really need to be recognizing that we're dealing with a different global context. We're dealing with a different transnational movement, right? Counter movement. We're not dealing with backlash, right? We're dealing with coordinated, strategized, well-resourced actors who are acting in very deliberate and well thought out ways. We also cannot think that, these people, these far right people, they just have these ideas that are fringe and they don't have real power. I mean, they clearly have power and they know how to access and influence power. So I think that is what we need to come to grips with when it comes to developing our strategies. Yeah, Lata, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I totally take your point about that sort of very public, detailed conversation about strategy is something that we need to think carefully about in terms of how we discuss that and what it looks like. I actually want to go back to something you said, Haley, which I think is so important that we don't talk enough about. And again, this question of research, and I know there's some of you in the Q&As, and I'm really appreciative of all of your questions and comments. Very rich discussions to be had, and so appreciative of UNRISD making the space. But obviously, it's never enough time. But one of the things that I think we have to be clear about, just building both on what Haley said in relation to care, but also the nature of this particular set of actors operating at these levels, is that it is so, the idea that we might have rights in and of ourselves to live lives in the way that we might want is so fundamentally destabilizing to the way that we organize our social, economic, and political lives, right? So we are so reliant on unpaid care, which is done disproportionately. If we look at the gender division of labor, we're reliant, the systems that we exist in are so reliant on unpaid reproductive and long-term life course care, that actually if we start to say that we want people to live fulfilled lives on their own terms, then that's actually fundamentally destabilizing. And we can see so when we see things like the retrenchment in things like public spending, that has started to then help to push back against that gender division of labor, we're starting to see more of these movements taking hold, because we're not able to find solutions for why it feels like our social fabrics and our safety nets are starting to crumble. And so then a common sense intuitive response is to strengthen the family, which within this system kind of also makes sense because it relies on all this unpaid care. So we have to sort of do some joined up thinking around the sorts of social, political, and economic settlements that actually enable us to fulfill the promise of the rights that we're seeking to have fulfilled, right? And that is quite a deep conversation, but it isn't a separate one, which is why I appreciate, Haley, what you just said, right? Which is, let's think about how we sort of do that joined up thinking, not just about where these movements, the anti-gender movements, are coming from, but why. Why are they able to strengthen? Obviously, there's the money. I'm not suggesting that isn't important, but the reason that the actual ideas have purchase is because it is speaking to a problem that all of us can identify with, right? I don't know if, again, Haley, you had anything you wanted to come back
No,
on
I
what
think
I've just said.
no, I think hopefully we can maybe fit in one more question. I see there are questions
Maybe
colonial issue and I don't know which one you want to pick
Haley,
up.
if you want to choose one of them, it's up
Okay,
to
sure.
you.
Yeah, I just saw there were a few questions just around, the now I'm just trying to go through here and see the coloniality, right? Oh yeah, here there's a question, anonymous. There's been a plethora of research on coloniality and LGBTIQ rights, homo nationalism, and heteronationalism. Um, but how do we bridge the gap between this ivory tower of research and on the ground activism? And I think in many ways this goes back to the question of how anti-gender actors, as Lata said, how they're getting purchase, right? And it has to do with, saying, look at what Western countries are doing, like Hillary Clinton's 2011 speech, gay rights are human rights. And this is now, the ways in which the gay rights, Western gay rights agenda is being folded into broader Western foreign policy objectives. And this is, of course, not helpful, as many, critical queer and feminist scholars have shown and argued, this is not good for queer people globally or for queer people in the United States or wherever these foreign policy objectives are coming from. And it also is playing into, it plays into, the claim by pro-family actors that they are actually more closely aligned and they are more in touch with the needs of African people or African communities, for example, than Western progressives. So, I mean, I think that this is where we need robust and loud voices from the global South, and there is a lot of advocacy going on in different parts of whatever the global South, broadly speaking, for time's sake, right? But there needs to be investment in strengthening the spaces and creating spaces where and strengthening the organizations that are doing this really important work, right? Of speaking from the global South, from the queer perspectives, the feminist perspectives and I mean, of course, we all know there are fabulous, amazing activists and researchers, in India, in African countries, in Latin American countries, who, I think, that's why we need to hear those voices so much, so that it doesn't just seem as though it's like a Western invention or a Western agenda, right? And that it's so dangerous, of course, right? Because I mean, we know how powerful, for instance, the idea that homosexuality is un-African has been. So, I think that's probably the best way of countering that, because it's a global issue, there are queer people everywhere, and
Yeah.
there are women and girls who need access to reproductive health services and rights all over the world. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Lata?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with everything you've said, obviously, but just picking up on some of the questions and comments, and I'm really sorry if we're not able to answer all of them. I mean, I'm really happy if people want to kind of be in touch separately. We can always pick up that conversation, always happy to continue the conversation. But I think, again, we can, for instance, hold our governments to account. And again, we highlighted in the report about the ways in which aid spending, and it is inadvertent in many instances, is being funneled to some of this. But we know that these movements are very well funded. But we need to do some joined up thinking. We need a more liberatory frame around what we think, development and rights should mean. And taking this point about, cisgendered straight men, if, liberation is liberation for everybody. So it isn't like we shouldn't be focusing on, LGBTQ people here and women and girls, which is part of what happens, I think, in the way that we talk about development. It would be much better to think, actually, we have shared interests, right? We have shared interests in how we actually live full lives that we value, everybody, so whether you are, queer or you're, heterosexual, whatever. So I think, and then making those demands for how we then support those movements. And just again, that business of it kind of being Western, there is always a danger that if you have aid money flowing, there's always a risk that, the language of gender is seen as suspicious. And again, this is why we would say doing that joined up thinking, but recognizing overtly that in a way, funding of, LGBTIQ plus activism is almost like a form of reparations for some of the colonial harm, allows us to approach that with a sense of humility, because we recognize that actually historically there's a reason why some of those views still persist and including in some of the penal codes that still exist around the world, right? Those colonial shadows are quite long. But I think we have to do that joined up thinking, where, liberation is not just for this group or that group. What does it look like for us to all be liberated outside of these frames? So, bringing all that activism together is, super, super important.
Well, I think that unfortunately we need to end this presentation, this webinar. So in closing, I would like to thank you so much, to thank the panelists, to thank all the attendees, and remind to the letters that your feedback is very important for us. So once the webinar is over, you will be prompted to complete a survey about the event. And said that, just say goodbye to everyone.
And thank you so much, Fabio, for your wonderful moderation.
You are welcome.
Thank you, Fabio, and thank you
Bye-bye.
to colleagues.
Thanks, everyone.